we can go ahead and get started. Let me give it one more second here to queue up and go. All right, I think we're recording. So George, you want to share your camera, and I'll let you start us off and welcome folks.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm George Friday. I'm one of the founding members and board member for Move to Amend. And I'm really glad to see tonight those of y'all who are on the webinar. And if you're on Facebook Live, thanks so much for joining us for why the world needs Move to Amend. We're going to have some back and forth a little bit and a little information, but really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. I want to turn it over to Caitlin Saposi-Belknap, our national coordinator and the person who keeps everything together and running smoothly with our excellent staff. I'll be here, Caitlin, if you need me, but over to you.
Okay, thank you, George, for doing this with me. So we haven't done this presentation before, so your feedback is welcome. Like George says, my name is Caitlin. I live in Sacramento, California, where I am right now. And we are going to give some background about why the way that Move to Amend is approaching this amendment effort is unique and critical, and why we can't have Move to Amend go away. If you're here, you probably know that we're in a bit of a budget crunch right now, a fundraising crunch. And we need to raise $150,000 by the end of the month. Otherwise, we're gonna have to make some serious cuts that will really set back our work. And so we don't wanna do that. We think you'll agree with us that the world needs us to not do that. So part of the point of this is to encourage everyone to contribute, but we'll get to that at the end and hopefully have made our case for why that's so important. So I'm just sticking up there to make sure that everything is working for everybody. You can type your questions in the chat bar at the bottom of the screen, but also there's a little Q&A button. Maybe it'll be at the top of your screen now that we're doing the screen share. It kind of shows up in different places depending on who you are here. So there's a little Q&A button that you can use to type your questions and comments as we go. And we'll certainly have time for that at the end. So first wanted to do a quick, just like a little bit of background about us. I know that some of you are already active with Move to Amend, but there were a lot of new people who signed up for the webinar. And so wanted to just give some basics. So George, do you want to do these first couple of slides to help introduce folks to kind of who we are and how we go about this?
Yes, thanks so much, Caitlin. So, sorry. Our primary mission with Move to Amend, you can see here, Move to Amend is made up of hundreds of organizations, and we've got hundreds of thousands of individuals. I think now it's about 440 or 450, 450,000 people that have signed onto our petition. Individuals who are committed to social and economic justice, ending corporate rule, and building a vibrant democracy that's genuinely accountable to the people, not just the corporate interests. That has motivated us to focus on goals of passing the We the People Amendment so that it's not at all complicated to folks. It's very clear that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights, and money is not speech. Seems very logical, but no, we need a constitutional amendment to make that clear. We also have the goal to make sure we are really seeding and supporting and nurturing and provoking a discussion and doing organizing so that we can make democracy real, tangible for everyone who lives in this country, because we will be renewing our Constitution so that it is relevant for those of us who are right now alive in this country. We have a set of principles and values that we follow and help to support and instill within our affiliates and the folks that support our work. Those include organizing around anti-oppression and solidarity principles, building a movement by building strong coalitions, doing the organizing from the ground up to make that happen, making sure that political education is included as we're building that movement, and working to get political and economic independence so that as we move forward, we're not beholden to anyone, not any organization, not any political party, not any agenda other than making sure we're having a we the people democracy. Caitlin, do you want to share more about strategy or you want me to continue?
Why don't you do this one and I think then I'll take over, I'm pretty sure.
Okay. We decided, along with the help and input and guidance of those of y'all who are affiliates and our affiliates across the country, that our primary focus for our work is not Congress, but building power. Because when you have power, that power translates to policy change, translate to systems change. So to do that, we have to build coalitions. We have to have the ability to reach out to organizations and build power with them based on how corporate power is negatively affecting them and the communities they care about and the issues that are priorities to them. So we're building a broad and diverse base that's multiracial, intergenerational, a movement that is centered in the experiences of those who are most affected by corporate rule. For some of us, that's generations have been negatively affected by corporate rule. So we're doing community organizing, not just activism, not simply putting out a tweet or a series of tweets, but sitting with people face to face, heart to heart, unpacking these issues and building power with them, sometimes with folks who haven't ever done this kind of thing before. So we've been focusing on grassroots organizing and passing local and state resolutions that have called for an amendment. Okay, Caitlin.
Awesome. Thank you, George. So I just want to underscore that a lot of the things that George went through really represent the ways that Move to Amend is very different than some of the other amendment organizations. So we're going to focus a good bit in our conversation tonight about why just overturning Citizens United doesn't do enough, and we'll get to that in just a second. But I just want to underscore that this is a movement made up of regular folks. We were started as 12 people in a living room. 12, I think, pretty amazing, awesome people. George is one of those people. And a number of, my colleagues were there as well. And so it's not like, we didn't have great minds, but we're also just folks who were not, previous members of congressional staff or, constitutional scholars, even though we have studied the Constitution and understand it better than a lot of constitutional scholars. We also, all of that is an asset for us, I think, because we actually can reach regular people because we are regular people ourselves. And a lot of the folks who are more resistant to kind of the systemic and radical, by radical, I mean, getting to the root of the problem approach that Move to Amend takes are kind of more establishment folks that, we're trying to shake things up quite a bit. And I think that that's important because right now the system is so very broken and so very much not working and hasn't, as George said, for generations. It's not a new problem. That's actually what it's going to take we need to have a revolutionary moment, and Move to Amend is committed to that. And we have never really minced words about that. We have never shied away from the task at hand and how huge it is. And though, because of that, we do not get the opportunity to get funding from, more wealthy people, more establishment organizations, and we've had to fight for every bit that we have. It also makes it possible for us to do a lot more on less than you would think. And so those are also assets, but we're just trying to give you a real sense of kind of who we are and what we're about. So I want to turn to this question though, because we're, why the world needs Move to Amend. So what do you think is the biggest issue facing humanity? And we've got a couple choices here, and I actually have this as a poll. So I'm going to stick it up and you can actually tell us what you think the answer is. Oops, no, and Sorry, these are in the wrong order apparently. Let me give you the right question. All right, start over. There you go. So I think you should be able to just click on your screen with what you think the answer is. And if it's other, then that's okay too. And feel free to type in the chat what it is. I can't actually share. It looks like I'm not going to be able to like see your answer. Well, can I? Yes. If you want to chat an other answer, you can go ahead and do that, and I can read it off also as well. And I think folks, George is a presenter. I think folks are seeing this in live in real time.
I can see it, but I don't seem to be able to vote.
Yeah, we can't vote. We can't skew the results. That's okay. If I were voting, I would put climate change probably, but all of these issues are incredibly critical.
Yep. I would do war, but again, they're all very...
Yeah. So it looks like not all of you have voted. You don't have to. But if you want to, now's your chance. And it looks like no one is choosing other. Okay. So, right. So climate change, war, hunger, species collapse, although, you know, folks are not picking that, but if the bees all go extinct, then we're not gonna have food. So you could also put that one and it would be maybe just as critical. So the next question is, what do you think is the biggest issue that is, oops, hold on. I'm new to this format. So what do you think is the biggest issue facing Americans? And obviously, we live in this world, and so those other questions apply to us too. Not trying to go for any kind of American exceptionalism here in any kind of bad way, but you know, specific to our country, do you think lack of accessible, affordable healthcare, pollution, massive incarceration, police militarization and violence, surveillance of citizens, wars for foreign oil, or again, if you want to pick another, feel free to do that. And then in the chat, feel free to let us know what that is. Judith says, corporate control is the biggest issue, which affects this entire list. Judith is active with Move to Amend, so she's got the spoiler. So a lot of people are saying, it looks like 44% are saying the lack of accessible and affordable healthcare, 11% say pollution, 22% are saying police militarization and violence, 1% are saying wars for foreign oil, and then a couple folks chose other. And I think this will let you see, there we go. I didn't do that last time. Learning how to use this. All right, so, okay. Oops, how do I get out of here? All right, so why haven't we solved these problems? Because actually, for many of them, the solution, it's not like we actually have to figure out the solution. I mean, climate change, which is incredibly complicated, we know that if we were burning less fossil fuel, we could slow down climate change tomorrow, right? We have to do it in a massive way, but you know, this world has actually embarked on massive projects before. And people have come together to solve or create conditions to change things around as much as what we would need to do for climate change. So we would say that we haven't solved these issues because we're not in charge of our government in this country. We the people are not in charge of our government. And as Judith said, corporate control is really where it's at. And the extremely wealthy, largely through corporations that they own, are actually setting public policy decision, deciding who will be in office, and determining what our future is, and whether we will solve these issues or whether we're going to ignore them or propose solutions that are false solutions that don't actually solve the problem. And we talk about Citizens United a lot, so just in case anybody doesn't know, Citizens United is a Supreme Court case and decision that came down in January 2010, which was actually the impetus for forming Move to Amend. So George and I and those rest of us who were at that founding meeting had been working against corporate constitutional rights and for democracy in this country, some folks going back multiple decades before Citizens United. And but we saw this looming Supreme Court decision that was about to come down, and came together and decided that this would be the moment that would make sense for us to form a coalition organization to call for solution to the problem of corporate constitutional rights for once and for all on a national level. Up until that point, we had been working locally in our communities at the grassroots level, and kind of networked, but not all together in one campaign. So all of these problems that we mentioned, some of them have gotten worse since Citizens United. Some of them have gotten worse since Citizens United, not necessarily because of Citizens United, but all of them actually exist. The conditions for the situation that we're in now, that all existed before Citizens United. It's not like Citizens United, it's not like in 2009, before Citizens United, our politics were working perfectly. We elected, the people who were not the most wealthy and had the most money to spend in their campaigns to office, or that corporations were not deciding fundamental public policy decision. I mean, remember the Iraq invasion and going into Iraq to try and successfully steal their oil under the impetus of, defending ourselves against the September 11th attacks. Right, that was all well before Citizens United, for example. That was, an example of a war for foreign oil and policies that benefited Halliburton Corporation and other arms manufacturers that, were the friends and literally the companies that were run by the people who were in power during the second Bush administration. So that's just one example, right? So yes, Move to Amend is closely tied with Citizens United, and Citizens United opened up a lot of people's eyes to the structural problem that we have in the law when corporations have constitutional rights and when money is speech. But the conditions that made Citizens United possible were all laid in place by the Supreme Court and corporate lawyers going back over 100 years before Citizens United. So I want to talk a little bit about that history because it's important that we understand it. And also, again, Move to Amend is really the only organization that is working at the national level that is out there that is providing this information in this context. So first of all, we're talking about amending the Constitution. So let's just get a quick refresher that we can all keep in our minds for how you do that according to the Constitution. So there's two ways to amend the Constitution. One is for 2/3 of both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, to pass a resolution, an amendment resolution, through their bodies. And then 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 38 states, need to ratify the amendment. The other option is a constitutional convention, which is also mentioned in Article 5 of the Constitution, which says that 2/3 of state legislatures call for a convention to propose an amendment, and then 3/4 of the states would still need to ratify any amendment that comes out of a convention of the states. So the second one is one that hasn't happened before. The first one is the one that folks are more familiar with. So that's the strategy that we focus more on right now. However, Move to Amend is not explicitly opposed to a convention under the right conditions. We actually think that that would be a more democratic and more populist way to amend the Constitution, but we would need to make sure that we actually had the power, as George referenced earlier, to be successful and to make sure that the only proposals that came from that were ones that moved us forward and didn't set us backwards. George, is there anything you want to add on any of this so far?
Not right now, thanks. It's very clear though, and the only thing to add is that, and you said it, we absolutely need a movement for this to work.
Absolutely, exactly. And that's another thing that sets Move to Amend apart, by focusing on the American public and looking at the ways that the Constitution has ever been amended before. Yes, I just went through the legal structural mechanics of what's required, but in order to make that possible, we need a people's movement. 2/3 of both houses of Congress are not going to, tomorrow or a week from now or 120 years from now, wake up and say, you know what we should do? We should set things right? Only if we build a movement for power that forces that to happen will. And in fact, if you look at this country's history, the times where we have amended the Constitution before, some of them have been just as difficult to imagine beforehand as the conditions that we're in right now. Ending slavery, women getting the right to vote took 75 years, right? And so it may all feel as though there's a lot to do, and there is, And that's part of what's important, I think, is that we not, mince words and kind of pretend like we're right on the brink of something that we're not. We actually are very far away from having power in this country, but part of the path to get there is recognizing what's really going on. That's almost like the first step. And so part of what Move to Amend is about is really naming it and being clear and real with people about the conditions that we're in and that we've been in for a very long time. So let's get into that history. So just real quick, we're talking about the Constitution, right? So the Constitution has two entities in it, and basically it is a document that talks about what the relationship between these two entities will be. And the entities are we the people, the first three words of the Constitution, and government. And the idea is that we the people are free and sovereign, and government is subordinate and accountable to the people. So all power that government has is delegated by the people, and all legitimate power comes from the people. And any power that government has is delegated for the purposes of protecting our individual rights, whereas government has collective duties. And then also we the people are seen as private and government is seen as public. Okay, so that's kind of the theoretical framework of the Constitution, just like really quick 101. One thing that we have to say right away when we're talking about personhood especially is that this document might sound all well and good, but at the founding of this country and for much of this history, we answered the question of who was going to be included in We the People and only included a small minority of people. Initially, it was only 5 to 7% of the population. So it was just wealthy, rich, white men who were Christian in some states who actually were able to participate and have full personhood status and the protections outlined in, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And the story of this country has been the story of people having to drive ourselves and have our personhood recognized. And meanwhile, while we were doing that, while women were doing that, while Black folks were doing that, while Native people were doing that, while immigrants from other countries were doing that, other people of color, we're still a fight to make sure that people who, have done their time and who are ex-felons have full rights, people, citizenship for folks who have grown up in this country and only lived in this country, etc. So it's still a struggle. Children, nature, but while we have been working on that struggle, on those struggles and that fight to drive ourselves into the Constitution, to claim this document and this supposed story of what America is about, corporations have been able to basically get in through the back door. So when we're going to talk about corporations, let's understand that when we started this country, corporations did exist. So the reason why corporations are not mentioned in the Constitution is not because corporations are like airplanes or something that nobody had thought of yet. That's actually not the case. There were corporations, and the early corporations right after the founding of the United States had a number of restrictions on them. They were seen as an economic tool that was very powerful and critical in some cases, but because corporations are about concentrating capital, that's basically what they're a tool that used to do, you have to be very careful about how they operate in society, because that power with that concentration of capital and wealth can come with, sort of a Pandora's box situation. So you got to keep them in the box. So in order to do that, every state had laws that included things like corporations could only exist for a certain amount of time. Corporations couldn't own other corporations. They weren't allowed to give charitable contributions or civic contributions. It was actually a felony for corporations to give money to political campaigns up until the 1950s in most states. There was restrictions on limited liability. So limited liability is that, you're separate from the corporation and you're as an owner, and what the corporation does is not personally what you do. But in some states, they actually didn't have limited liability, or if they did, it was sort of like double liability. So maybe you'd have some protection, but if you went too far, you could still be held accountable as the individuals behind the corporation. Corporations couldn't own property outside of the specific need for their charter, so they couldn't just kind of be in all realms. I mean, if you think about the fact that there's only really like a handful of corporations operating in this world, and everybody is they're all gobbling up each other and kind of, own all sorts of things, entertainment companies, own food companies, and like, what is all that? All that was illegal. no interlocking boards of directors. Directors had to live in the state where a corporation did business. And kind of the most important thing is that every corporation had to prove that it served the public good. And in order to come into existence and to get a charter, they had to actually go to the state legislature, and it was basically as much work as passing a bill or a law. And in that had to make the case that in some way they were going to serve the public good, and that's why there was a justification for them to come into existence. So can you imagine if that was the threshold that corporations had to pass today, that they had to serve the public good in order to exist? So properly understood in terms of our framework and the Constitution, even though corporations are not mentioned in the Constitution, corporations make sense to be over here on this side of the line because they're subordinate and accountable, they have collective duties, they're actually public, their records would be available to either the state government or sometimes just the public at large, because they are creatures of the government. They're created by government. They don't just come into existence. They're not born, right? Corporations only exist because government creates them. They're, an administrative procedural institution. And so properly understood, they kind of belong over here on this government line with the same kinds of restrictions that government has on it, in theory. But after the Civil War, you had a ton more people driving themselves into the Constitution, right? Black folks, by passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and the abolitionist movement being successful. And you also had, you had a number of folks in the elite concerned about how they were going to hold on to their power, since the tried and true mechanism of enslaving human beings and defining everyone else as not persons was getting kind of shaky as people were rising up. So you had impetus on behalf of the wealthy elite to kind of come up with another strategy to maintain their control. And then also the Industrial Revolution and Manifest Destiny and that whole era, and actually also extreme corruption that happened after the Civil War, all sort of made like a corporate heyday field day, seconded only by maybe the situation that we're in now. So you have a number of Supreme Court decisions that come down as a result of this power and basically agenda on the part of corporate lawyers, mostly railroad lawyers, to try and make the case that corporations should be seen as people under the 14th Amendment, which says that no state can deny anyone equal protection under the law. So all these laws that treated corporations differently than people, because they are different than people, were in jeopardy when these corporate lawyers created this idea, this doctrine of corporate constitutional rights. So I'm going to run through some of these cases just to give you a sense of kind of what the Supreme Court has done to us. San Mateo County versus Southern Pacific Railroad is one of the earlier cases. This is where they first make the case that corporations are people under the 14th Amendment, and actually they argue in this case that the 14th Amendment always intended to mean people. And I think we really need to get our heads around how twisted it is that the 14th Amendment, which was actually put in place to try and guarantee that Jim Crow didn't happen, that segregation didn't happen, that the southern states and northern states as well had to treat everyone equally regardless of their skin color, which the Supreme Court did away with in the Plessy v. Ferguson case and actually said segregation was constitutional. So that same court basically was hearing this argument that, oh, no, the 14th Amendment was supposed to apply to corporations too, even though that obviously had nothing to do with why the Civil War was fought. They did not win that case. They were unsuccessful, but that just gives you a sense of kind of, they started early and they actually for about 5 years tried repeatedly to get to cases to the Supreme Court where they could make that argument. So finally in 1886, even though the court again didn't really actually rule on this, whether the 14th Amendment covered corporations, what is inserted in the headnotes of this case is a weird sort of sentence that supposedly the court said, we don't want to hear the argument about whether a corporation is a person for the purposes of the 14th Amendment. Amendment, because we're all of the opinion that it is. And then this case is cited, the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which was actually May 10th, 1886. So we're coming up on the anniversary of this, as a precedent to hold that a private corporation is a natural person. And out of that, judges struck down hundreds, and potentially at this point, if we were to really go back, thousands of local, state, and federal laws that were enacted to protect people from corporate harm based on this illegitimate premise, which was concocted by corporate lawyers that were incredibly corrupt. This is the robber baron era because of the corruption. So here's another railroad case in 1889, where the court officially does rule that a corporation is a person for both due process and equal protection. So we can't just say, oh, that Santa Clara case happened in a weird way, that doesn't count, it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, it was a conspiracy perhaps, but subsequently 3 years later, the court actually did officially rule. So this is the law as interpreted by the Supreme Court, and as new lawyers are taught in law school and the whole 9 yards. In 1905, in this Lochner versus New York case, Lochner becomes shorthand for using the Constitution to invalidate government regulation of corporations. So basically, for 30 years, the court invalidates approximately 200 economic regulations, usually under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, meant to limit corporate power and to protect against consolidation of corporations. So the court uses this case to strike all of those regulations down. In 1906, corporations are able to get Fourth Amendment search and seizure protection. So remember that Constitution where it has individuals and people are private and the government is public. Well, in this case, they're able to make the case that no, they actually have private protections against search and seizure. One of the justices who disagreed said the power of the government by its representatives to look into the books, records, and papers of a corporation of its own creation to ascertain whether the corporation has obeyed or is defying the law will be greatly curtailed, if not destroyed. So our ability to know what corporations is doing has really been off limits since 1906. This case, Dodge versus Ford Motor Company, is actually a Michigan Supreme Court decision, so it didn't go all the way up to the US Supreme Court, but it is cited as sort of the standing end of the story case on stockholder primacy. So in this case, Dodge and Ford, those probably sound familiar, right? So we all probably remember the story vaguely of like how Ford was such a good businessman because he paid his workers enough to be able to buy his cars. Well, when he made that policy decision, the Dodge brothers used to be shareholders in the Ford company before they left and started their own car company. And they, as shareholders, didn't agree with that decision. They thought it was going to eat into their profits. And they sued Ford and made the case that the number one responsibility of any officer of a corporation, including the CEO, is to maximize profit for shareholders. So before, the purpose of a corporation was to serve the public good. But these automobile barons got into a little tiff of their own to say, no, your primary purpose, no matter who you are, even if the company is named after you, Ford, is to maximize profit for us. And the court system agreed and said yes. So now that is the definition of what a corporation is. It's an entity that, part of the DNA of it is to maximize profit for shareholders. But it's important that we understand that that DNA wasn't always the case. There used to be something else. And it's, again, a human construct. Like a corporation in general, none of this is inevitable. These are choices that get made, and we can undo it and build something different if we want to. But right now, even if a company, a CEO wants to try and do something altruistic or look out for the workers or the environment in some way that's going to affect the bottom line, that has to be something that the whole company is on board with, because if not, then that CEO can actually be held personally liable for not maximizing profit for shareholders. In this case, in 1922, Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mahon, corporations get the Fifth Amendment takings clause. So the takings clause says that your property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. So in this case, the coal industry was digging under people's homes in Pennsylvania, so much so that they were collapsing. Entire towns were like collapsing in these sinkholes because of the oil and coal industry digging for coal. And so Pennsylvania passed a law that said, okay, you can't, there has to be restrictions on how much you can do this. You can't, make our towns collapse. And so that's against the law. And the coal industry sued Pennsylvania and said, okay, that's fine, you can pass that law, but you have to pay us for all the money that we would have made if you hadn't passed it, because you have taken our property, that future profit, that's our property, and you're using it for public use, i.e. making it so towns don't collapse. And so you have to compensate us. And that stood with the Supreme Court. And so this is the law. And this is why environmental regulation has to be so anemic in terms of what's possible. We can't actually just say, let's just, ban some corporate chemical that is, harming our community, or fracking if it's destroying our water. But you can't do that, because as a town or even a state, they can say, well, okay, but you have to pay us for all of that. And what community in this day and age has those resources, right? So it creates a huge chilling effect, and local government most of the time won't even entertain something that would actually really solve the problem, because they know that they'll be on the hook for paying for it. And that's what, municipal attorneys will tell city council members, oh, no, you can't go there. You can't actually protect your public in this way because you'll get sued. Lois K. Leggett versus Lee is another 14th Amendment case. So in this case, a community in Florida was trying to tax chain stores differently than it was taxing local businesses, and in an effort to try and protect the local economy and encourage people to, buy local by having it cost less. And they were sued because that was discrimination. You can't discriminate between one kind of corporate person and another. And so economic democracy and defining our communities and what kinds of businesses we want to have in our communities based on their behavior is off limits and off the table and unconstitutional, according to the Supreme Court, since the 1930s. Then in the 70s, this is, kind of coming up on the Reagan era, and kind of in reaction to the 60s, you have a number of cases that have to deal with the First Amendment and trying to expand. In this case, now we're looking at the money as speech part of things. So in 1976, the Supreme Court rules that political money is equivalent to speech, and expanded the First Amendment protections to include financial contributions to candidates or parties. So this affected, this is mostly something that is in favor of wealthy people, because it means that now spending money in a political race is protected by the First Amendment. So if you have more money, then, you get more speech, and that's okay, because, that's how this country works. It's capitalism, right? And so the idea of the First Amendment as an equalizing force, and also the idea that we all have access to decide who will represent us, is sort of, this is the beginning of that being off the table, because now the wealthy can dominate the political process. So didn't start with Citizens United. Citizens United was built on this Buckley v. Vallejo case. And then the next year, the court made clear that corporations would also have those First Amendment rights. In Massachusetts, they used to have a law that banned corporations from contributing money to ballot initiatives, and almost every ballot initiative state had laws like that. And the court ruled that unconstitutional and said that no, states can't actually prohibit corporations from contributing money to ballot initiatives, which is why, like in California where I live, when you look at the ballot, most of what's on there is financed by large corporations, either to put it forward or to fight against what we're trying to do if we're trying to protect ourselves from pharmaceutical companies, or have single payer healthcare or something like that. We have to compete with corporate dollars in on the ballot. This case was from 1996, International Dairy Foods Association versus Amistoy. This is a case where Vermont passed a law requiring labeling of bovine growth hormone on all dairy products. And the dairy industry sued Vermont and made the case that the First Amendment gives us a right not to speak. And so that label on their product is a violation of their First Amendment, and we can't actually force them to tell us what's in our food. And potentially any other labeling that we would potentially want to do, the same thing would happen. So this has also happened when states have tried to pass laws to require the labeling of genetically modified food, for example. Then we've got the Citizens United decision in 2010, and this was the launch of Move to Amend as well. We launched on the day of the Citizens United decision because we were ready to go and prepared for it to be the way that it was, and really trying to give this backstory so that people would understand where this came from and that it wasn't a new problem. And we were really successful at doing that, I'll say. You know, a lot of the media right after talked about corporate personhood with Citizens United, even though the case actually doesn't talk about it that much, but we know that that's what it's grounded in. And so we've been able to kind of shift that discussion from the very beginning as Move to Amend. And I would say that we're the organization that is single most responsible for that. So Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission overturned the McCain-Feingold legislation, which was in place to try and limit the spending in elections by political action committees and sort of outside of campaigns, money coming in from other sources. So 24 states had campaign finance laws that were strong and protected the public from being, you know, overrun with private money or corporate money in their elections. Those were all deemed unconstitutional. So basically, Citizens United legalizes corporate bribery and extortion. And it was the most recent time, you know, a lot of those other cases kind of go pretty far back, that the court did explicitly offer rationale for corporate constitutional rights, which sometimes is called corporate personhood, but more accurately is really corporate constitutional rights. And then they didn't stop there, right? So in 2014, we had another case that really wasn't so much about corporations, but it removed the limits to campaign contributions from individual donors. There used to be, you know, a threshold that aggregate a wealthy person could contribute to federal campaigns. This was thrown out because supposedly it violates the First Amendment. And so now, you know, we see a lot more money in the political process because of those two cases. And then this Burwell versus Hobby Lobby store is also in 2014. So this has nothing to do with money in politics. Another reason why we can't just overturn Citizens United. We actually have to undo everything that has propped up and made Citizens United possible. So in this case, Hobby Lobby sued and made the argument that they should not have to follow provisions of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare that their owners disagreed with, because their owners are fundamentalist Christians who don't believe in birth control and reproductive health for women. And they made the argument that their corporations' First Amendment rights to religious freedom were violated, and the Supreme Court agreed. So you've got this situation where part of the purpose of a corporation is to be separate from the owners, right? That's the idea of limited liability, that, you know, it's a separate entity, it gets treated separately, it gets taxed separately, the profit is treated separately. When laws are broken, it's treated separately. So they want all of that separation, right? And that's still, you know, A-okay as far as corporate owners are concerned. But then they also make the case that the most private and personal decision and that you could hold, what faith to have, is something that your corporation is infused with and is not separate from you. And in fact, you know, it shares your faith. So never mind all of the other people in the corporation who work for the corporation or whatever their faith may be, the owner's faith is what matters here. And they did originally say that this only applied to closely held corporations like Hobby Lobby, but the Trump administration has expanded that, and so all corporations have religious freedom at this point. So we haven't seen this happen yet, but the implications are that there could be discrimination against people for religious beliefs, like in particular, in this day and age, potentially Muslims, discrimination against LGBTQ people under this argument that corporations have religious freedom. So when corporations are able to move over to the other side of the line, it basically corrupts the whole situation. It makes it impossible for us to meaningfully control or regulate their behavior. It certainly makes it possible for us to have a meaningful say over our government when money is also speech. And so the whole idea of the framework of the Constitution is thrown out the window. And we already have identified how problematic our Constitution initially was, and that it excluded most people. But we have done a lot of work since then to address that. There's still work to do, and we certainly could have a more democratic Constitution that centralized human rights over property rights, right? But with the conditions that we currently have, it makes it impossible for us to meaningfully regulate or hold accountable the most powerful institutions that are created by our government. And so basically we talk about legalizing democracy because corporate constitutional rights makes democracy unconstitutional, because we don't actually, democracy means the people have the power. Well, we don't actually have the power over corporations. In fact, they have the power over our government instead of us. And so that leaves democracy unconstitutional, basically. So the solution to that is the We the People Amendment. It is straightforward, it is concise, it is clear, it makes clear that artificial entities don't have constitutional rights. So any entity created by government, that means for-profit corporations, but also nonprofit corporations like Citizens United, like unions as well, and anything else that we might concoct in the future, does not have constitutional rights if it's not a human being. And it makes clear that spending money in elections is not protected by the First Amendment, so that we actually can have, if we wanted to, we could have publicly funded elections or other mechanisms to make it so that we all have an equal voice and a say, and that's what we should be striving for. And when the First Amendment protects campaign spending, then that's not possible at all. And it requires campaign spending to be publicly disclosed. And it has been introduced in the House of Representatives. Our lead sponsor is Rick Nolan. We've doubled our number of co-sponsors in the last year, and we continue to build and grow more. We're working on getting it introduced in the Senate as well. But the We the People Amendment is the most straightforward and clear amendment proposal that there is, and it is the only one that addresses both of the key points that corporations do not have constitutional rights and money is not speech. And so if move to amend were to go away, I mean, those of us who really care about this would probably try to find ways in our free time to make sure that this, was still introduced in Congress. But honestly, there is nobody else to pick up this fight. If move to amend isn't the ones leading it. And in fact, a lot of the time we're actually having to argue and challenge some of the other more establishment DC organizations that are not willing to actually solve this problem in the most fundamental and critical way, that would like to see, a lesser solution or something that would barely do anything at all, just say that Congress has the authority to regulate campaign spending again, which just takes us at best back to 2009 if Congress actually were to put in place legislation, right? So that's a lot of ifs and hopes and prayers that wouldn't actually get it done, right? So our movement, some of our successes, and again, our office has been, for the first several years, it was in the living room of my home. Then we moved to Sacramento, and my partner and I purchased a duplex, and we had moved to amend next door. We now have gone to having everyone work from home because we think that's actually more economical and is better for our staff, and that way we can have staff all over the country, which is important because we're trying to organize a continent here, right? And so, but that's just to give you a sense of on very little, we have been able to get over 800 city and town resolutions passed all over the country, including hundreds of citizens initiatives that, when they go to the ballot, pass every time, even in conservative communities. 19 states, including 4 by ballot initiative, have called for a 28th Amendment. We have hundreds of thousands of citizen volunteers. There are thousands of organizations, labor unions, and faith congregations that have stood with us, all starting from 12 people in a living room. And there's no question that we could do more with more resources, but what we have been able to generate, we've raised over $2 million since our beginning in 2010, so over 8 years, $2 million, which is almost nothing to have been able to do all of this. A lot of our staff are paid very little. A lot of folks put in volunteer time as well. And all of our affiliates all over the country who are doing this work at the local level in their communities, who are actually the ones who are really running these ballot initiatives and collecting the signatures, they are all volunteers. So this is a true people's movement. And every other successful people's movement has been similarly scrappy, right? I mean, social movements do not come out of professional change agents, right? They don't come out of Congress. They come out of regular people. I mean, obviously Martin Luther King, now we think of him as, but he was a regular person doing work out of his home, right? And every other person that we know of who, Rosa Parks or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these folks were rubbing pennies together in order to make it happen. And luckily they had the support of thousands of people that we don't know their names, who were also leaders and who were chipping in money, who were chipping in time. And that's how it gets done. And that's how we have to do it here. And so we decided that it would make more sense for us to, when we were coming up on a shortfall, and the last few months have been sort of hoping that we can turn it around and working hard, but not sounding the alarm bells. And this month we realized that, no, we need to actually be clear with people where things are at right now and how critical it is that people support Move to Amend right now, because without your support, we're not going to just disappear tomorrow. But if we have to cut back any of our 13, well, at this point now we're at 11 staff, because some folks actually stepped away on their own because of their support for Move to Amend and the fact that they were able to kind of make other things work in their lives, but are still volunteering. But if we have to cut back on anything that we're doing right now, we will lose headway. And we already have so much that we're up against. There are other organizations that use our talking points to, support basically corporate Democrats that are not doing anything to end Citizens United, let alone corporate constitutional rights, but they are using all of our momentum and our energy to fundraise to the tune of millions of dollars. There are other organizations that would like to see this get watered down because they think we're going too far. But we know that when we talk to the American people, no matter what kind of people we're talking about, people resonate with the fact that we are actually proposing a solution that will get the job done instead of something scrappy, marginal, just kind of tinkering around the edges. People are very tired of that being the suggestion for these huge problems that we have, like climate change or, people literally dying every day because they don't have health care, that if we lived in another country, they would still be alive, right? And so we're the only group that's going to be talking about these things. So we have to stay here.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Caitlin, but we really are at a moment in history where we cannot afford to be pragmatic or polite or patient. There's too much at stake, and the folks who have been capitalizing literally on the Constitution, eroding rights for people, expanding power for the very, very wealthy, those folks are not going to back down. And if they keep rolling their machine, imagine where we would be in a dozen years, 30 years, 50 years in this country, let alone a half a decade. This is the time where we have the opportunity to really create democracy for the first time for some people ever in this country, and to protect it for those who have experienced it up to now. But if we lose this moment, we may never see it again, because we are at a threshold that's not likely to come around again. I don't imagine folks in the women's suffrage movement or the abolitionist movement realized when they were at the peak point where, okay, we've got to push through and get to this win or we'll lose momentum. And that's part of what's going on in the country now. It's echoed across the planet, as I learned this weekend at a conference, in terms of things going on in Brazil and Chile and other parts of the world. So it's very important that if you care about real democracy in this country, take seriously what we're saying, take serious this movement, and do everything possible to make sure we succeed. Okay, sorry, Caitlin.
No, don't be sorry. Thank you, George. It's perfect. What she said. So we have a strategic plan. We thought it was very important. I mean, it's not like we didn't have a plan from the beginning, but putting it all down, being transparent, straightforward, clear, and accountable to our supporters, accountable. If we're going to build a movement, it's important that the leadership of any movement be accountable to everyone else who is involved, right? And so we saw putting together a strategic plan that would be written, that would keep ourselves accountable, keep us on track. And so you can check out that plan if you haven't yet at movetoamend.org/plan. We put it in place in 2016. We've been able to surpass some of our goals in terms of our momentum and speed. Some of them we're a bit behind on, like getting it introduced in the Senate. And again, that has to do with our accountability. You know, a lot of groups would just say, "Yay, we're doing it all and we're done," and you know, or "We've won." You know, how many times have you got an email or you know, a letter in the mail talking about, you know, victory, and then you look at what has been won and it's tiny compared to the problem. And it's not to say that there isn't really good work going on out there, but I think we need to hold ourselves accountable as those who are working for social justice to say, are we actually winning? Are we actually successful? Or are we just saying that because that's what funders we think want to hear? So none of that is what you will find at Move to Amend. So a lot of it we're on track with, some of it we're behind with. A lot of people also say 10 years, we can't wait 10 years to pass this amendment. To which I say, I agree with you, we need it yesterday. And yet, if you look at where we are right now, kind of as a starting point, 2016, and then what has happened since then, we got a long ways to go, and we can't gloss that over. We can't pretend as though we're not in dire situation right now, because we are. But to me, that brings, you know, hope, because we're being real with each other, and we're not just kind of, I was going to say it in a bad way, but, you know, messing around with solutions that aren't actually going to make people's lives significantly better. That's what's at stake. And so that's what we have to take ourselves seriously enough to be real about where we are and what's needed to get to where we need to go, right? And so you can check out the plan, and it is ever evolving. You know, as new things happen, we need to make adjustments, and so we do that every year. Some of our programs and campaigns that we have going on right now that would stop, actually all of them are sort of on, most of them are on pause for May while we try to catch up on our fundraising for the year. Really going back to the end of 2016, when we found that a lot of the energy and momentum and funds and support that we had was kind of pulled away into the presidential election. And that does make sense in some ways, because the presidential election is important, but unfortunately a lot of it didn't end up coming back for a couple of reasons. One, people got really hopeless. A lot of the people who are on our list, who are our supporters, are white middle-class folks who honestly have the luxury of being able to check out in response to Trump being president, which is really a tragedy, because there are a lot of other people who cannot check out. And because their lives are on the line, right? And so we've seen more people at risk and threatened. And so there have been resources that have been generated for that. And that's important and critical. But we can't lose sight of the longer term vision, because if we're just putting out fires, you know, that story of like, there's all these babies, you know, these people come upon a river and there's all these babies in the river, and they're drowning. And so they jump in, they start trying to grab the babies, you know, rescue the babies, pull the babies out. And then one woman starts walking up river, and they're like, what are you doing? We need you over here to get the babies. That baby just got lost. You know, and she's like, I'm going up river to find out who's dropping these babies in the water, and I'm going to get them, right? So that's what Move to Amend is we're going after the, you know, baby killers in the river, and we need the resources, we need the support to do that, because that river is full of too many babies for us to just focus on each one individually. There are people who are doing that work, and that work needs to happen, because if it's talking about, you know, the baby surviving or not, or, you know, a family going hungry or not, or getting deported tomorrow or not, we can't leave that. But we also have to dig deep and make sure that we're still investing in whoever is going to structurally make it so that this cannot keep happening, right? And Move to Amend is not the only one of those organizations that's doing structural systemic work, but there aren't that many compared to the ones who are, and there are a lot of other organizations who work on any which thing and jump on whatever issue is sort of most pending. And that's the part that bothers me, is like, okay, if you're, you know, protecting your neighbors or yourselves or, you know, your community from imminent harm, okay, absolutely. I would never say not to do that. I certainly do that in my community, right? But if you're an organization that just hops on whatever is sort of the most trendy thing, and for a while it was ending Citizens United, and so that's what you did, but now you're working on Trump because that's what gets everyone's attention. I think that we just do our whole larger movement a disservice when that's the way we treat social change and making, you know, trying to get us to a different place. So the programs and campaigns that we have going on right now, Pledge to Amend is a campaign to focus on people running for office and make clear that they need to have a position on this amendment if they want to be in elected office, whether it's state, federal, or local, and they need to pledge to support this amendment if they want to get our vote. And so it's a big election year, so we haven't entirely put Pledge to Amend on hold, but we need to be able to do Pledge to Amend in a big way this year, and we need to not cut back on our staff who make that possible. We the People Lobby is a campaign to train people on how to lobby our representatives. That's how we've doubled our co-sponsors in the House, but we also, you know, can't forget about state legislatures, because to amend the Constitution, you need to get 38 states to ratify it. So that means focusing on state legislators. And so we're gonna have a lobby day as part of our conference next month in DC, but then also in August, we wanna be able to have a big lobby month when our representatives are in district in their communities and hold them accountable. We have an amazing internship program where we train, generally it's, you know, 5 to 8 young people in 2 cycles. So, you know, 10 to 20 young people on how to run an organization and how to build a movement and how to organize. We're still in the process of kind of exploring how direct action is a tactic that fits within our work. And so that's an ongoing effort to do training and connect with other organizations that are doing direct action. We do grassroots organizing training and support for all of our volunteers across the country. So we offer webinars once a month. We do in-person trainings when we're able to get to their communities. We create tons of materials. Our website has tons of free resources that we have learned that folks use in other movements as well, which we're happy to have happen. But all of that is freely available, and somebody has to generate that and curate it and keep it up to date. And that's all an important program that we do. Our Leadership Summit is what we call our biannual conference that we do every 2 years. So this is a year that we're doing the Leadership Summit. It's next month in Washington, DC. And it's a really important conference for both training our folks, bringing people together to network, and then also connecting with other movements that are working against corporate power in other ways. Our movement education program is a in-person and online training, 5-session training that we do for our affiliate leaders, looking at a number of different things. Movement history, so that we can take lessons from movements that have been able to amend the Constitution and change fundamental laws successfully before us, but also where did things go wrong and how do we guard against making the same mistakes. And then also looking at privilege and oppression and culture, and how when we create organizations, we unconsciously will, you know, make organizations in a culture that is comfortable for us. But that potentially excludes anybody who comes from a background or experience around decision-making, around communication, around power, around conflict that is different than us. Right? And in this country, we are extremely segregated around race. We are also pretty segregated around age. And so Move to Amend's commitment to build a multiracial movement, both because that's obviously the right thing to do if we're going to be talking about personhood, we need to recognize that the story of this country is one of a flawed story of personhood. That's actually our most basic fundamental roots, is a going wrong and, you know, saying that human beings are property, or you know, savages that are not worthy of being recognized for their humanity. And so it's no accident that we are where we are right now. So if we're going to build a multiracial movement, one, we're leaving out a huge context if we don't talk about that. But also, if you look at the demographics of this country, in order to win, we actually have to be multiracial. And that doesn't just happen, because segregation and white supremacy make it so that we have huge trust issues between races and communities, even folks who live in the same towns, right? And so how do we intentionally get the skills to be able to push through that, overcome that in our organizing? That's something that actually requires, conscientious time and attention and skills building. Just like, you got to build your solidarity muscles. And so we recognize that just saying that that's a principle, and same thing with the intergenerational piece. I mean, we literally are talking like different languages when we're talking about, 20-year-olds versus 70-year-olds, and we have both in Move to Amend and everybody in between. So we need to build up the skills of our organizers in order to effectively do that. And that translates then to any other work that is happening in communities. And so our movement education program is an evolving program that we put together when we recognized that just saying that needed to happen wasn't going to make it successful. And we did we put that whole program together. We've, seen a lot of interest from like foundations and funders who are like, oh, that's intriguing. But we did all of that without, a grant to do it, which is a lot of times what, another group might require in order to do it. But just recognizing this is just so essential that we've got to build these resources. A lot of it was put together by volunteers on our board. And we're also looking at trying to do something online that would be open to anyone and everyone to learn some of this, because it's incredibly important right now. George, do you want to add anything in on that? You came on. No? Okay.
Thanks. I think you've covered it. I don't think there's anything I can add.
Okay, cool.
And I want us to be able to get to any questions.
Yep, we're almost done here with the presentation part. And then our barnstorming tours are when we go out on the road. We have a number of speakers, awesome speakers, who tell this history that we went through today, but also talk about, how to get involved in Move to Amend. And then we also offer support for our grassroots affiliate folks when we're in their communities, and that's how we get groups started. Some of you who are on this call are here because you first came to a barnstorming talk. And then Resolutions to Amend is the campaign, ongoing campaign to get resolutions passed in communities all over the country. So it's a ton of work. Again, when you look at our budget, it is, our goal is to raise $575,000 this year. Last year, we only raised $400,000, so we got this all done on $400,000, which, I mean, back before I ran an organization, that sounds like a lot, but for, what all that we're trying to do, paying people's wages, keeping the lights on, making sure the phone will, ring through when you answer it, that all adds up to a lot. And we are able to get a ton done on very little because of all the ways that we cut corners, including sometimes sacrifices that we make. Our employees don't have healthcare, which is something that is really not in keeping with our values, but haven't been able to do anything about yet. Barely make minimum wage. And so nobody is in this to make a buck, I guess, is my point. So here's kind of, per the strategic plan, sort of a sense of like the momentum. This is a graphic from that document to, kind of like the three fronts that we need to be working on to grow. And so our programs kind of all fit within those three areas. This is kind of, this might be a little bit hard to follow quickly, but basically just kind of showing again the pace. And if you think that 10 years is too long before we get there, then we have all the steps that need to be taken. We just need to do them faster, right? And we could do that if we could scale up even more than where we're at right now. So just wanted to, again, for transparency's sake, give you a little bit of information about kind of how we raise, where our money comes from, and how we use it. So on the left here is the how we use it. Sorry about this weird typo here with the text. I'm not sure what happened there. But so a lot of it is the program staffing. But, again, this isn't people in cushy offices with cushy, paychecks or what is it, IRAs and, retirements and benefits and all that sort of stuff. This is doing all the work that we've laid out that needs to be done. Then we also, you know, it costs money to travel around the country. We put on conferences and trainings, so that costs money. And then, you know, our operating and fundraising is, you know, just a small percentage overall of, this is our goal for 2018 budget. And then in terms of where this money ideally will come from, in terms of how we look at it. So we really need to get our monthly sustainers up. So if you are not yet a monthly sustainer, please think about becoming one. We could have everything covered if everybody on our list just gave, you know, a few dollars. Now, everybody is not going to give a few dollars. So if you're in a position to give $28, then please do. If you're in a position to give $100, which some people do, please do. But if all you can give is $5 or $3, then every bit counts. And if we could get our monthly sustainer number even higher than this, right now we only bring in about $6,000 a month from sustainers. We'd like to get that up to 12 as part of this push in May. But in terms of the long-term sustainability of Move to Amend, that's where it comes from. Because if we can do that, then we won't be beholden to anyone. If one person, you know, comes off because they, you know, get laid off, well, you know, that's only $10 a month, and we can cover that, you know, as opposed to relying on larger donations where, you know, if it doesn't come through, then we're in a real bind. So we also generate money from those barnstorming tours, although you'll see, you know, they generally, you know, we invest more than we were able to raise. We pass the hat at all events and stuff like that, but it costs money to travel around the country. We do get some charitable contributions because we have a 501c3, but again, for our long-term health and viability, it's most important that our funds come in as non-tax deductible donations so that we are more free to spend them on the policy work that we do. And then we sell some materials, and again, these conferences and trainings actually, if all goes well, you know, generate a little bit of income. So that is that. Happy to answer any questions that folks have about it. And kind of just a sense of like who we are when I'm talking about our staff and our national team. This picture is slightly out of date, so there's a couple people missing, and there's a couple people who are not officially in this capacity. This is from last year, but this is our team. You can see, you know, we have a lot of diversity in terms of age, race, background. These folks are from all over the country. It's not very often that we get to be all together, and we think that's really important, actually, that we have folks all over the country. And then the map down below are, you know, unfortunately you don't have faces. It would have taken a lot longer to kind of put all of our affiliate faces on there, but these bubbles represent all of our local groups all across the country who are doing this work in their communities. So, you know, again, we are regular folks who would just believe that this is the most important thing and have figured out how to put together an amazingly effective and incredibly industrious and efficient organization. But the reality is that we're currently not operating in terms of what we're bringing in fundraising in a way that is going to, you know, keep us going. And so we need to infuse right now in May, and then we actually need folks to commit in an ongoing way in however much you can as a sustainer to make it so that we're not in crisis, but we can just focus on the work. So a little bit about our structure, just wanted to mention that I already have referenced this. We have local affiliate groups. We will be growing into having state chapters. And then we have, you know, our national team, which is staff, interns, and board. So we are very grassroots, and we are led by those volunteers at the board level, but then also all of our local affiliates are volunteers. So here we are. This is how you can get involved. You can make a donation. We need to raise $150,000 this month. Some of you have already donated, so thank you. If you haven't yet become a sustainer, we need to increase our monthly donations to $12,000 a month. We need to double them. You could start a group, Move to Amend Grassroots, and we would love to work with you to get a group started. That's one of the programs that's not on hold in May. You could come to our Leadership Summit, which actually generates a little bit of income, but also is a way to come together in Washington, D.C. in June. And then you can help us grow by collecting petitions, either paper petitions or sharing the link to our motion to amend with your friends and asking them to join you at a minimum to just join and state their support, but ideally to join with you in making a contribution. We have a little bit of time. What do we got? 15 minutes for any questions or discussion. So you can type your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A button, or you can click the Q&A button to get to your questions. Or you can type them in the chat as well, which I need to pull up. Whatever's sort of easier for you, we should be able to see both. So yeah, I've got both up. And George, is there anything you want to add while we're waiting to see if there are any questions? I'll just add this comment that Judith, who's one of our affiliate leaders from San Jose in California, Move to Amend's movement education program opened a tremendously vast and valuable discussion in the area of anti-oppression and the importance of reaching out to those different from ourselves at movement education sessions for Santa Clara County Move to Amend members. Thank you. I'm glad that you feel that way. And there are, you know, that is resoundingly the response that folks have had to that program. And we have also learned that folks in other organizations have used pieces of it as well.
I think the thing I would add, first and foremost, is thanks. Thanks for being here tonight with us. Thanks for sticking with us and listening, and for any form of support that you're able to provide. Also for sharing this with other people. And really to also think, it's an odd term to use, but think about your grandparents and your great-grandparents. If you can imagine 7 generations behind you and 7 generations in front of you, what can we do now to make sure that those folks who are here 2 or 3 generations from us experience democracy, that their voice matters? For many, many people, they don't feel like they're seen as full humans in this country, and certainly aren't treated like it. And we collectively have the power to change that. And thank you for doing what you can to get us there. All righty.
George. So let's see, there's a couple. Sue says Montanans Move to Amend is working on fundraising. Thank you. Greg reported that to us on our call today. So thanks for that, Sue, and to all of you in Montana. Vicky asks, can you please explain the difference between the charitable contributions and non-charitable money and how it is used differently? Sure, yeah, absolutely. So we have 2 different funds. We have the Move to Amend, which is a 501c4 organization, meaning that donations to Move to Amend directly are not tax deductible, and we are allowed to use that money under IRS law for advocacy, which includes lobbying. So obviously you can see what the lobbying connection is. We the People Amendment, you know, legislation in Congress, and any support for that needs to come from the 501c4 fund. Any staffing that are working on that, any materials we put together for that, etc. And then the 501c3 fund is administered by Democracy Unlimited, which is one of our founding coalition partners. And they administer a fund called the Move to Amend Education Fund. And that fund, money donated to that fund is charitable contribution, is tax deductible as a 501c3. It is earmarked for the education fund, so it only gets used to support that, not any other activities that Democracy Unlimited might do. And we can use those funds for like our barnstorming tours, the movement education program, if we're able to expand that to the online training that I said, you know, that would all be educational. Some of the leadership summit can count for that. So we actually end up having to kind of parse it out. But honestly, it is so much easier for us if folks can give to the 501c4 because then we do not have to, you know, track those dollars as closely in terms of whether they are used for education versus advocacy. Obviously, they're both tracked, and we report to the IRS, and also, you know, happy to report to our supporters too. But there's just more restrictions on those charitable contributions. But foundations are only able to give, most of the time, 501c3 donations. And then we do have a few, you know, wealthier folks who give, you know, maybe $10,000, $20,000, never more than 40, I think is the most we've ever gotten from one donation. But most of the time those are charitable contributions because they need a tax write-off. So I hope that answered your question, Vicki. You can also write to donations@movetoamend.org if you have any additional specific questions. A couple other things, you can contribute to Move to Amend through making stock donations. If that is an easier way, then you can donate to the education fund that way. You can put Move to Amend in your will. And we're also exploring other ways to make contributions. If you have frequent flyer miles or something like that, we do a lot of travel. And so we're kind of trying to see if that's something that we could set up as another way that people can contribute. Okay, let's see. Pat asks, where is the copy of the petition that can be printed for signing by interested people and we can use it to send to Move to Amend's office? Yeah, great question. So let me see if I can get out of there. And no, this is going to be too hard. Never mind. So if you go to movetoamend.org/petition, I think is where you can find it. And I'll include a link in the chat. I think it's either petition or petitioning. And that's where you can download the paper petition and also, or a link to like an easy online share for your friends. Thanks for your question, Pat in Missouri. And then let's see, also asks, will the PowerPoint you presented tonight be available for us for meetings in our localities? Yeah, well, what did I just do? Oh, George, oh, there we go. movetoamend.org/petition. She like stole the screen share from me. That was feisty. I like it. Thank you. Way to take charge. So it was movetoamend.org/petition to answer Pat's question, and everybody else can help with that. And then let's see, what was I answering? Oh, the PowerPoint, yes, we will make it available. We'll post this recording online. It normally takes a day, so tomorrow it'll be available for us to post online, and then we'll send it to everybody who registered, and we'll include a PDF of the slides. And Vicki says, this cost is somewhat complicated to explain for me. Are there dummy bullet points I can use? Yes, there are talking points, and there's a whole list of them that are bulleted, and then you can kind of grab the ones that feel most comfortable for you. So if you go—
And we don't have any dummies that Move to Amend.
Yeah, I was sorry, I was just reading what she said. But you're right, you're not a dummy, and nobody is. But if you need it to be simplified, then yeah, you definitely don't need to go through all those cases. So if you go to movetoamend.org/toolkit and look under the talking points section, that's where you can find a number of different resources to help make it easier to communicate about this. And then we also sell our materials, so like our brochures, and we have a little postcard, things like that. We sell those at cost on our website. So if you want to petition or get like a little packet of brochures to pass out to people or to hand to friends that you're telling about this, that can also help so that you don't have to remember everything or explain everything. You can give them something concrete to put in their hands.
And edit out the cases so they're not too many. You want enough so that people are motivated, also known as pissed off, because anger can be energy to get something happening. But you also don't want so many that you're defeated and bummed out. There's a very delicate balance there. So find out what works or what you feel like will work for your group or the folks that you're talking to.
There's also some other example presentations that you could use, like that are a little bit shorter. We kind of went for like, okay, we're going to tell you all the things because we're laying it all out. But normally the presentation would be more like half an hour rather than a whole hour. For the PowerPoints that are on our website. So I don't see any more questions there. Let me check in the chat and make sure. Let's see. Sue asked, do you have a letter that we can share with potential donors about how the $150,000 will be used to expand the donor bases and stabilize the budget and staff, please? So we don't have that yet. We're working on putting that together, but also where we're at right now is that we need to kind of raise that money, and that will partly give us the cushion to kind of go in and say, okay, this, how do we need to adjust the way that we're doing fundraising to be more effective? And
we have talking points we can share with people now that you can include.
Yeah, we do have the talking points around, you know, kind of the current situation. And Greg, just for folks, what our outreach director was just in Montana and working with Sue and others. So it did let us know that you're looking for that. And we are going to be sending a letter to our donors. And so when we have that, we'll be putting that together starting this week, probably putting it in the mail next week. And so when we have that, then we'd be happy to share it with their affiliate folks who want to use it to fundraise as well. And we really appreciate your help. So I don't see any more questions or comments. So last call if anybody has any. And let's see, I'm gonna go back to our presentation here because there was just a couple other things. So we're here. So there is going to be a feedback survey at the end of this webinar that you can give us your feedback, and we'd love to get that. And then if you have any questions going forward, you can write us at donations@movetoamend.org actually, and that'll help it get more quickly to somebody. We answer every single message that we get, but sometimes it can take a little bit in the general box. And so a reminder to please make a contribution if you haven't yet already. That's like the most important thing. Let's see. Maybe talk about Jacqueline's question, or I think you meant Sue's question about plans to address operating costs. I mean, the reality, so Ben asked that, the reality is that we can't cut. I mean, we will if we need to in order to exist, but we don't have any fat in our budget. We never did. And so we're not in a position to be able to cut and do everything that we're doing. And we could stand to, you know, I mean, there's more to do than even we have time to do, right? So the way we're looking at this is that the goal is to actually infuse and grow our fundraising, and a lot of how we think that that's going to be most viable is through the sustainer piece. We are looking at some foundations that have been interested in some of our work and kind of cultivating those relationships. And we're in the process right now with talking with our larger donors who have invested in us over the years to get their input and also their kind of connections and ideas for other ways to get some, you know, larger kind of grants from, but that's all 501c3 money, right? So that's part of also why the sustainer thing is so valuable, because it allows each of us, I mean, I'm a sustainer, I give $28 a month. All of our staff and board are sustaining members, and it allows each of us to actually give a lot more money than we could probably in one lump sum, not need to take a tax donation or tax deduction, and then allows us to give to Move to Amend in the way that is most effective for getting the work done. So that's really where we're trying to lean. And then if we do have to make cuts, then, you know, then we will. Right now we've got staff operating on a 25% cut for this month, which is pretty big for folks who don't have savings. And honestly, right now, nobody's really working less hours. We're more just volunteering those extra hours. So that's not sustainable, but that's to kind of help us get through the hump as well and doing our part. And, but we really actually need to ramp back to where we were in terms of the hours and the time. And I mean, we'll continue to be incredibly frugal, but I wish, you know, we could easily just, you know, make some cuts, but we've never operated with any kind of excess, you know, so we take red eyes, we put together all kinds of harebrained travel to save a few $100s here and there, and that's how we've always done it. So it's like we never stay in hotels when we travel. We always get host housing, which, you know, when you're on the road and on all the time, even when you go home to rest, that's hard, you know, but those are the ways that we've made sure that there's no surplus resources going to waste. So we're not in a position to cut unless we're going to scale back on what we're doing. And if we need to do that, then that will be where we're at. But we're really hoping that we can raise this money in May and put ourselves in a position to then more effectively fundraise, especially on the sustainer piece going forward. One of the other things that we're kind of up against is that people are not opening their emails as much. And that we have learned is not just us, that's the world. People don't answer their phone. So our staff actually do fundraising time every other week and have for years. But most of what we're doing there is leaving messages because we don't actually reach people because people don't answer their phones. So having to try and find new ways, and maybe in the long run, looking at, you know, raising money through canvassing, which is one way that some organizations do it, but you have to have kind of a lot of capacity for that. But we do have an issue that resonates with almost everyone. And so that might be something, but we would need resources to to fund that and then make it, you know, self-sustaining. And so, but for the future, that's one of the ideas that is in the mix as well. And open to any others that folks have. But we're also, you know, we're 8 years old. We're at kind of a natural point where we need to sort of scale up, and really our budget should be more like, you know, $1 to $1.5 million for kind of where we are and what we need to be doing. So that's also where we need to go. So stepping back and kind of cutting is not going to help us move in that direction. So that's what we're trying to avoid, if at all possible. And there are some of us who will do this work even if we're not paid. But if we have to go get other jobs, then you know, then our time that we can put into it is minimal. But you know, I did this work for 3 years before getting any money from Move to Amend. So if we have to, we'll go back to that. And you know, that's just the honest truth of where everything is at.
But doing that means we lose momentum,
right.
And we don't get to scale in the timeline that we need to based on our strategic plan. We don't hit the marks that are in our strategic plan. We'd have to adjust our strategic plan to a great degree if we have to scale back.
Right. The other thing too is that our affiliates don't currently contribute any money to our budget. I mean, they have to fundraise for themselves, and they're all volunteers, and they don't necessarily have fundraising experience or skills. But a lot of chapter organizations like Move to Amend actually rely on those grassroots folks to help contribute. And so that's another thing that we'll explore, you know, but is that going to be a deterrent to joining up with Move to Amend? So how do we do that in a way that then we can support those affiliates in doing that fundraising if that's the route that we go down? So a couple more questions and then we'll close up for the night. So Sue says, are affiliates setting their own goals for fundraising? I hope so. We're honestly having to kind of, you know, focus on making sure that all of our staff are we're like in campaign mode, you know, ourselves. And so we just had calls with all affiliates last week. And are going to be kind of going back, and we have our coalition call. We have a monthly call with affiliates for those of you who are not affiliates on Tuesday next week. So that'll be a chance to check in with affiliates, and this will be the main agenda topic. And then, you know, kind of everybody's checking in with their meetings and figuring that out. So I think that's a great idea, though, for affiliates to set their own goal for fundraising. And some affiliates have been fundraising for us all along and sending checks, you know, that they get, you know, like quarterly, pooling a portion of their contributions, but a lot of them don't.
I see a question I want to answer. I hope it's our last question since it's 9:30. From Vicky that says, would you say this effort has bipartisan support? Absolutely. It's one of our strengths. We've gotten resolutions passed in highly Republican cities and towns. And We've got co-sponsors that include North Carolina's own Walter Jones. I believe it's Walter Jones. And I think we had a co-sponsor who's also a Republican co-sponsors too, yes?
Yeah.
So yes, we definitely have bipartisan support.
Yeah. Especially, like regular Republicans, polling shows, support this in almost as high numbers as folks in other parties. So the leadership of the Republican Party, not as much, but regular Americans who belong to the Republican Party are on board with this overwhelmingly, just like Democrats and independents and Greens and libertarians. So, as George said, it is late, especially for those of you on the East Coast. Thanks for sticking with us. We will be doing this training 3 more times in different ways. I guess to last question, should we be asking for sustaining donations, or is it more important to get the money up front now? We're in a little bit of a pickle because it's like saying 2 different things, but I think that actually depends on the donor. Like if the person is in a position to donate more by giving in a sustaining way, then that's, if they're doing that by credit card, then we are kind of getting that commitment right away. And they can do that, you can do that on our website. And so that is great. But if somebody is, for whatever reason, the way their income comes in, more in a position to give $500 right now and really can't do it as a sustainer, then, that's okay. But really in the long run, we do need those sustainers. So I would say trying to move people in that direction and then to give as generously as they can with that. That is what will not just get us over this hump, but also keep us going after, because we don't want to come back in 3 more months and say, we need another $150,000, which, is basically, 3 months of basic costs covered. So let's go for those sustainers, unless somebody tells you that they'll give you $500 right now, in which case say thank you very much, and that's great. Okay, everyone, we're gonna let you go, but you can please fill out the survey and let us know. We're gonna tweak this as we go, so it's been helpful to have you here on this first one. If you could give us your honest feedback, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for being part of Move to Amend. Thank you, George, for joining me tonight, and we will talk to you again very soon. George, you wanna say anything else as closing?
Just thanks so much and good night. Have a great week, everyone.
Okay.
Keep up the good fight.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Good night, Caitlin.
Good night, George. Love ya.